will begin now. Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to see so many of you here on this spring Geneva day. I hope we will get more sun soon this afternoon. We'll be present here physically and also online. Thank you for attending this book launch event entitled Collisions, the Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability by Professor Michael Kimmage. This event is part of the Geneva Security Debate series. For those who don't know me, my name is Alexandra Matas. I'm directing the International Security Dialogue Department here at the GCSP. I design and oversee a number of dialogue processes in Geneva and internationally, with the primary focus on the future of European security. The 24th of February 2022 was a crucial turning point for European security, with far-reaching political, economic, social, diplomatic implications for the European continent and far beyond, and of course with terrible humanitarian costs. Today we are going to look at the origins of the war as specified in the title of your book, the reaction to it in the West and globally, and finally we will think together how to move forward from the current stalemate to a more peaceful security order. To help us on this journey, we have two esteemed speakers. Professor Michael Kimmage, who is the author of the book. Michael combines two very interesting profiles, I think, for this discussion. Professor Kimmage is a historian, so he is currently senior associate, he is a professor of history at Catholic University of America and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Security Studies, CSIS. And at the same time, Michael has first-hand practitioner experience as he served at the State Department under Obama administration in the period of from 2004 to 2016. This period is, of course, very relevant for the topic we are discussing today. Michael Kimmage is also the author of Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, published by Basic Books in 2020. He writes regularly on international relations for foreign affairs, and he's also the chair of the Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
And we invited Ambassador Thomas Greminger to share his thoughts and significant insights on the topic. Ambassador Greminger is a Swiss diplomat and the director of our center, the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He is also bringing his available knowledge and experience as a former Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Ambassador Greminger also holds a PhD in history. So I believe we can have a very interesting discussion here between these two historians and two practitioners at the same time. So with that brief introduction, I will now begin our debate. In the middle, we will make a small session of questions and answers to give the opportunity to the audience who needs to leave a little bit earlier today to ask their questions. And then we will continue again the discussions and make the second round of Q&A at the end of the debate. So, Michael, my first question goes to you. The book, I think it's the most obvious one. The book is entitled Collisions, the Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. Why collisions in plural?
First of all, thank you so much, Sasha, for the very kind introduction, and to you both, Thomas and Sasha, for the invitation to appear before this distinguished audience this afternoon. And although it's my first trip to the center and first trip to Geneva, it very much feels like being among friends because of prior conversations and meetings in Washington, and that's very nice. for me as well. But now to the matter at hand. I will answer your question and come up with one generalization about the plural collisions that may be of use to this audience. But I'd like to emphasize, of course, history is important, but I know that this is an audience of policymakers and people who are invested in various kinds of diplomatic processes, and so that's where I would like to maintain my focus to the extent that I can on this topic. So rather than collision, collisions to me imply something that's fundamental to the argument of the book, which is that the war in Ukraine, whether we understand it as the 2022 to the present war, or the war that begins in 2014, is not one collision or not one war, but three separate collisions, and possibly, although this might not be the perfect word, three separate wars that are occurring simultaneously. And so let me describe what I mean by that, and we'll try to extrapolate from that a conclusion related to diplomatic process. Obviously, this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. That doesn't demand a lot of explanation. These are the two major armies that are combating each other. There are deep historical reasons and causes for the conflict between these two countries. And since the war has now in its second and a half year become a war of attrition, it's also very much a war of political economy. And so the militaries matter preeminently, but political economy is probably going to determine the course of the war. But we could also factor in many other things, culture, religion, civilization, geography, language, all of that is pertinent to the Russia-Ukraine axis of the conflict. But I'm not going to dwell on that because I think it's so self-evident that it doesn't need a lot of explanation. The second axis of conflict, the second collision that goes into the collisions of my title, is the Russia-Europe axis. And here, we would take a step back historically to understand where to begin, which is itself a complicated question with this subject. We could begin in 2009 with the European Union making a decision to implement something or to initiate something called the Eastern Partnership Program, which was directed at Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And this was not something to which the world was paying great attention. It didn't seem all that spectacular. It could be a kind of bureaucratic legal process that was aimed more at commerce than classical geopolitics. And yet what happened as a result of the Eastern Partnership Program is that an association agreement was offered to Ukraine, and that gradually became a dilemma for the then president of Ukraine from 2010 to 2013, Viktor Yanukovych. And he tried to balance, affiliations with Russia and affiliations with Europe or with the European Union. In the end, he couldn't really do it. And in November of 2013, he made the decision not to sign the association agreement. And that, of course, sparked a revolution in Ukraine. So that's a well-known story, I think, but I just mention it to foreground the importance of Europe in this story. On the Ukrainian side, Ukraine's path to Europe is of the essence with the war. That's one of Ukraine's core war aims, is to build and to continue on its path into institutional Europe. So in a sense, that too takes us back to 2009 and the Eastern Partnership Program. And it's also the case that Europe, writ large, is a key supplier of financial and military assistance to Ukraine and has been since the 24th of February, 2022. It's also true on the Russian side that two matters related to Europe are preeminent with the war. One is Russia's own place in Europe, or Russia's own ability to shape and influence Europe's security architecture. And the other, of course, is Ukraine's place in Europe as well. That this is not just a conflict from the Russian side over the particular configurations of the Donbass. It's not just a conflict over what kind of polity Ukraine is. It is a conflict over Europe and foregrounded by the place and the role of Ukraine in Europe as the Kremlin sees it. And of course, the Kremlin has preferences, which are not the preferences, to put it mildly, that are held in Kiev. But the Europe-Russia axis is very important. There too, we have hundreds of years of history that we could bring to bear on an understanding of why between Russia and Europe, conflict and war has tended to recur. Finally, I wouldn't be from the city of Washington if I didn't wish to put the United States at the center of the picture. That's a national trait that we have, and I think it is at least defensible and legitimate in this particular context. I would not put the United States in such a central position in 2013, 2014, 2015. I don't know if the US really had a Ukraine policy then, and that was not a time when relations with Russia were so deeply conflictual, although of course in the wake of the annexation of Crimea in February of 2014, beginning in February of 2014, the US implements sanctions a bit before the European Union does, and the US was a presence in the diplomacy that was enacted between France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, so-called Minsk diplomacy of 2014, 2015, but the US was not, I think, that central of an actor. But if we fast forward to 2021, 2022, you see the United States coming much closer to the conflict. So in ways that we could spend a lot of time articulating, the US uses intelligence in vastly new ways in the 6 months before the war, really changing precedents that had been taken for granted in Washington for a very long time before that. And then in the few weeks before the war, maybe a few months before the war, the US really begins to expand and augment the kind of military assistance it's giving to Ukraine. We tend to focus a lot on weapons. We also should focus on provision of intelligence and targeting from the US to Ukraine, amounting to, I think, what for American standards is a massive program of trying to assist, equip, and aid Ukraine in its war. You know, there have been ups and downs in that since. There's the supplemental and all of that, but I think we're speaking about roughly $100 billion in aid and a movement past all kinds of thresholds that were once sacrosanct during the Cold War. So that suggests, in a sense, how important this conflict is to the United States. On the Russian side, I'm less able to judge exactly how the world is seen there. I wouldn't take Kremlin rhetoric as completely factual or completely accurate in this regard, but if you do look at Kremlin rhetoric, there's the sense that Ukraine itself is not a real nation. It's sort of a puppet or a shell. And in a way, Europe is also not all that real either. It too is a kind of shell. And behind these two shells, you have the United States. You know, the collective West is a term that looms large in Russian rhetoric about the war. And the engine of the collective West is the United States. And the reason that NATO matters in the way that it does is that it's a US-led security structure and organization. Okay, maybe that's not exactly the worldview of the Kremlin, but to the degree that it is, you see how important the US is in this conflict, and therefore how important the US-Russia axis is. The US-Russia axis also gives the war its nuclear component. If you have the world's two major nuclear powers on either sides of a conflict, that means that the nuclear element is implicit, which it is to this war. And I would say, although I don't think of this war as a world war in the way that the First and Second World Wars were, this is a war with countless global dimensions, and I think that that really emanates out of the US-Russian friction that's there, in addition to the US-Ukrainian and US-Europe friction. But the US element, I think, is what helps, as it were, to globalize the war. A final point that I'll make, which takes us back to diplomacy. If you accept this framing of the war as three parts, or at least three parts, I think what follows from that is that each of these axes of conflict has a different point of origin. In Washington, what's immediately brought back is the Cold War. That's, I think, not the issue for Ukraine. What's maybe brought back is the Soviet period or the pre-Soviet period. In Europe, there are another set of reference points altogether, but a different point of origin in the case of all three conflicts, a different internal dynamic. That the way that the war is being fought between Ukraine and Russia is not how the war is being fought between Europe and Russia. Europe is keeping its soldiers off the territory of Ukraine, is sort of limiting itself in some regards. And so far, with a few qualifications, Russia has been very reluctant to see the war spread beyond the territory of Ukraine and onto the territory of NATO member states. So there's a different dynamic there, and certainly the US-Russian dynamic is its own thing altogether. And here's, I think, the point, I'll conclude on this point, that matters most for diplomacy and diplomatic action and for the diplomatic imagination. I think there will be three separate points of termination to each of these three conflicts. I don't think that they will end on the same day. I don't think that they will all end in the same manner. And I don't think the diplomacy is going to be the same in all three cases. I think there will be diplomacy when we move toward the termination of the war. It's not to say that diplomacy is not going to happen. To the contrary, but it's going to be a variegated, multi-phase, multi-level diplomacy. And frankly, the historian in me struggles to think of an analogy or comparison. Certainly the Second World War ended in a very particular way without this kind of complexity, in the First World War, I think is largely similar. Maybe the end of the Cold War could be brought forward, but it seems a peculiar aspect, or a remarkable aspect of this war. And so with emphasis, I would like to make that as the concluding point of my opening comments.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I actually had a question why you start your book with 2008, but I think that you answered my question already, that basically you see the different collisions have different starting point. And for US, for instance, it's the end of the Cold War. And that's very often what we're discussing also in the expert setting, that the end of the Cold War was in a way some of the root cause of this conflict.
Yeah, Sasha, that's good that you're looking at me, because I would like to come back to this third level of the collisions, and that is the US-Russia one. But, I should say at the outset, I find that very plausible, this model of the three levels of collision. That makes a lot of sense when I was reading your book. As somebody that was involved in the management of what we then called the crisis in around Ukraine in 2014-15, and not a war. Perhaps that's then a separate discussion. But in 14, when we saw, this crisis in Ukraine mounting and mounting, we Swiss chairing the OEC back then, we proposed to create a contact group. When the Swiss chair in office of the OEC addressed the UN Security Council, he suggested, to follow the good example in the Western Balkans, to create a contact group of the key stakeholders. Obviously, we didn't spell out who should be part of that, but we thought, the United States would have to be part. And indeed, then there was, I still recall that very well, on Easter Thursday, 2014, there was a contact group meeting here in Geneva, where, the United States, the European Union, Russia and Ukraine got together. They had a discussion. It was not, a breakthrough, but I think it managed to diffuse some of the tensions. Obviously, there was no chance to even seriously address the annexation of the Crimea issue. And then what, was to us, crisis managers sitting in Vienna, in Bern, what was quite strange to see that then a few months later, there was a totally different configuration of the contact group popping up, the Normandy 4. And somewhere between basically, April and June, the US got lost. And the question I still can't answer until today, why, Is it because back then Russia was still considered to be a status quo power, so not as dangerous for European security as in 2021? And this would obviously be, this is, the eternal question, when was the tipping point? When, tips Russia into a neo-imperial, revanchist, neo-colonial power. Is that in the reading in Washington in 2021? And is that the reason why then, all of a sudden, there was a totally different focus on Ukraine? Or, what brought this change about? In between, let's say, 14 and 21, you obviously had times where the US was engaging more actively. There was for quite a while a very active US special envoy that worked not formally as part of the Minsk process, but I mean, he was very influential. And so I would regularly talk to him when I wanted to have, to make sure that, you know, a view of the OSCE would get through to not only Washington, but also to Kiev. So yeah, I mean, can you help us, Michael?
I think so. I always am much more at a loss in terms of reading the Kremlin, and the White House is marginally less opaque to me in this regard. And so let me break an answer into three parts to try to see where U.S. thinking changed and start exactly where your question starts, Thomas, with 2014 and why the U.S. was not a part of the formal diplomatic processes, which was much debated, I can recall, in the State Department and in Washington. So that was the subject of some controversy. I can offer two answers to that question, one of which is sort of the formal official answer that's maybe a little bit closer to the real answer, although they're both real answers. If you would have had the chance to have the White House weigh in 2014, they would have said that this is the hour of Europe, and that what you don't want is a rerun of the 1990s in Yugoslavia, where the U.S. comes with its military power and then, in a sense, dictates terms, and Europe is in the backseat of a conflict that's happening in Europe. The assumption was, I think, that these are different times and that Europe has different capacities and that it's a better outcome if the U.S. is just a little bit more reticent and Europe is more in the foreground. You could substitute the word Germany for Europe, and probably that would work from an Obama administration perspective. Of course, the working relationship between President Obama and Chancellor Merkel was excellent. So there was just a lot of trust there that she was the person. She's a Russian speaker. She had the East German background. She understood Putin. I think that was also the assumption. And so this was going to work out as an example of European leadership. That was the hope, and that was one reason why the U.S. didn't want to plunge in. I think the other is that the U.S. had sort of a combination of not having an agenda, not really knowing what they wanted. Aspirationally, they wanted the Russians to get out of Ukraine, but how are you going to do it? And there just wasn't that much leverage that the U.S. had. So I don't mean to be cynical in this regard, as if the U.S. was setting Europe up to fail. I don't think that was the case at all. But in some ways, given how hard the problem was, not really being able to get what you want and not having all that much leverage, maybe better not to be so deeply implicated in the challenges of this kind of diplomacy. Nobody would have said that openly, but I suspect that was a part of the mix. To pick up one thread there for the second answer to the question about not having an agenda, the hardest part of the book for me was to write about the Trump years. There are lots of things as a historian that are really hard about Trump. And one is separating the theater from the reality, which is just a punishingly difficult task. But I would say when it comes to Trump and Ukraine, that he just had no agenda, none that I can find. He had an agenda with China, he had an agenda with trade, he had an agenda with Iran, he had an agenda in the Middle East. It's not like he had no agendas, but on Ukraine, I can't see one. He wanted to solve the problem, he wanted to have a good relationship with Putin, he wanted it to go away. I mean, you would get that in the rhetoric, but in the absence of an agenda, nothing happened, unsurprisingly, on the US side. And so those are years, I characterize them or think of them as years of drift for the US. And I think they were quite costly in retrospect, the absence of trying, the absence of doing things, the absence of having an agenda. Finally, and going briefly over this topic, although it fascinates me greatly how the Obama administration, rather the Biden administration, functions in its first 12 months in office. I think, as we can all recall, this is the perfect city to mention it because the summit meeting was between Presidents Biden and Putin here. The first 6 months of the Biden presidency were characterized by a drive for a stable and predictable relationship. I think that was felt to be achievable. And a lot of what Russian behavior was before 2021 was, understood to be conducive to that. And if that was achievable, there would be a lot of payoffs, that things would normalize and stabilize further. In Ukraine, the Ukraine that wasn't Crimea or the Donbass, the U.S. could, of course, concentrate on the Indo-Pacific and China, on the pandemic, on other issues, and that would be, just beneficial. That, of course, vanishes by September, October of 2021. And the final point I would make, and I think this one you can really make with evidence and with clarity, is that the Biden administration does not change intellectually. They don't figure out Putin in that year. They don't see his agenda and they don't understand his agenda. All they start to recognize is that the intelligence is pointing in the direction of a huge invasion. And so they are to be credited, I think, for believing that intelligence. It must have been exceptionally good. And they acted upon that intelligence in ways that I've described a moment ago with the lead up to the war as the US construed it. But it was not like they figured out Putin. In a sense, the intelligence is also ahead of their understanding because they kept wondering, well, we have the intelligence, we know that he's going to do it, or we think that he's going to do it, but we really don't know why. So they couldn't crack that code, perhaps until the war itself, or perhaps they still can't crack that code. So that itself is very interesting to me, that the intellectual realizations come very, very late, if at all, in the process.
Well, thank you very much and for answering these questions and already moving forward. Basically, there are a few topics that I would like also to touch upon still on the Biden-Putin summit here and also on the prospects of the re-election of President Trump. I would be interested to hear from you in the future. But let's just maybe come back a little bit to this period before 2021 and even maybe before 2008 when you start your book. So you provided both now this historical facts and analysis, and we can really learn from them in terms of if the involvement of the United States was so important and could things have been different if for instance, the United States was part of this contact group back in 2014. Do you think, Michael, there were some diplomatic missteps on the way? What might have changed the outcome and today we would be in a different situation, or was this invasion inevitable? You did mention it now, but you speak in your book about President Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, which a lot of experts consider to be a milestone in the Russia-West relations and rivalry. So what, in your view, we could have done differently at that time?
I think to answer that question, we have to go into a big picture analysis. I do think, and this is one of the key debates about the war, that there's a fairly strong accidental component to it, to the war, certainly the 2014 part of it, but by extension also 2022. So I don't believe in this war being inevitable. And that's precisely why I don't start the book in 2007 with the Munich Security Conference speech, because you're already, if you do that, the rest of the argument just makes itself, and that's what I wanted to get away from. The contingency or accident is Yanukovych's flight, in my opinion, late night, February 21 or early morning, February 22 in 2014. I think that's the accident, a little bit equivalent to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in the summer of 1914, that just sets all kinds of chain reactions, unpredictable, anarchic chain reactions in motion. So following from that point, let me make two additional points about what could have been done differently. I think that the huge missed opportunity on the part of the West, Europe, and the United States was not to have a Marshall Plan for Russia in the 1990s. If you think of US spending now, $100 billion for the war, it's going to be more in the future. I don't know what the European numbers are, hundreds of billions of dollars. By comparison, a Marshall Plan would have been cheap, I'm sure. And that's one of the reasons why the Marshall Plan, the actual Marshall Plan, was implemented in the 1940s. Would that have built more goodwill, sort of people to people on the side of the Russian population? Possibly. And that could have been a good thing. And in a way, the picture is bleaker than there not being a Marshall Plan. Not only was that the case, but the US in particular exported a lot of really toxic neoliberal ideas to Russia, which I think built a generation of ill will toward the United States. That does not point inevitably toward war, but that ill will, of course, does become a feature of Putinism later on. Wouldn't say that the US is the cause of it or the West is the cause of it, but they failed to be the solution to that problem after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's large, that's in the background, but that's certainly on my mind. More to the point, and possibly also relevant for future iterations of this conflict and of this crisis. I think the years before 2013 were very much wasted years when it comes to diplomacy. The US is really annoyed about Snowden. The US doesn't like the kind of Putin who comes back to power in 2012. Putin doesn't like the US that criticizes the elections and the Bolotnaya Square protests in 2012, et cetera. It's all kind of souring the tone of the relationship. And that was really costly for everybody involved, for Ukraine, for Russia, for the US, and for Europe, because there's really no framework whatsoever when you get the Maidan Revolution. And there's really no framework when Yanukovych flees. There actually was a process. If you go back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, Europe and the US and Russia and Ukraine worked it out. You have a revolution, but you have a degree of diplomatic consensus that got Ukraine over the hump. That doesn't happen in 2013, 2014. There's no consultation really in the months before, and that could have been useful because I think that contributes to this aura of misreading, of a sort of extreme response on the Russian side, the bafflement that's on the other side of the conflict by that point. And there, I think that there were missed opportunities. There was just not enough dialogue and discussion before the crisis came. And so when the crisis came, it's as if nobody really had the equipment for dealing with it in a consensual, pragmatic, sort of practical manner. After 2014, I think it's another conversation, but that's what I would focus on in terms of grievous missed opportunities.
Not enough dialogue. Thomas, would you agree to that?
Well, I experienced exactly what you're, telling us. I was part of the OECD Troika in 2013, obviously, and we saw the crisis mounting. We did not see, what then came out of it, but we saw the crisis mounting clearly, and of course, everybody was kind of in a state of denial, and mostly the Ukrainians themselves, they denied that mounting crisis. There were also no frameworks within Ukraine, to deal. There was no dialogue within Ukraine, and that remained so, unfortunately. And so I think another missed opportunity that we saw from trying to manage the crisis in around Ukraine was once Crimea was gone, we then focused, everybody focused on, making sure that the crisis in the Donbass would not spin out of control. And then in April 2014, we launched an inter-Ukrainian dialogue process that was led by Ambassador Ischinger, and that had quite some traction, I must say. Yeah? I'm not pretending this could have prevented then, the escalation in the Donbass later on, but it was, at least for a time being, it was quite promising. Then Poroshenko was elected, and we were all happy, how smoothly the election happened. And by the way, nobody was seriously trying to undermine these elections. Everybody was kind of, trying to prevent any further escalation of what we then called the crisis around Ukraine. But after Poroshenko became president, he stopped the inter-Ukrainian dialogue. So it was not pursued. For me, clearly a missed opportunity. And then, if you go further during the process of trying to implement the Minsk agreements, again, I would see in different moments in time missed opportunities where perhaps there was on one side a will to go further, to really implement the Minsk agreements, but not at the same time on the other. And so, looking back, I think not implementing seriously at practically any point in time between 14 and 21, the Minsk agreements, that is for me another missed opportunity.
I found interesting in your book, basically you also mentioned about Minsk, that Minsk was not a defeat for Ukraine in theory, Minsk was the way for everyone to exit the crisis. That is something that also can be a lesson learned.
But you also said Minsk is Kafkaesque. So you said both.
I'm going to struggle for the rest of my life to understand what Minsk was. It's to me the most confusing of all examples. And since we have students among us, just the space between words and reality, which is always there in everything that we do, but certainly there in diplomacy, is you have no better case study of that. Wherever you come down in terms of your interpretation, no better case study of that than in Minsk. Everything revolves and goes back to Minsk. It's the keystone to the, intellectually, it's the keystone to understanding the two wars, 2014 and 2022.
Now, if you agree, I would like to move to 2021. You already start talking about it. The Geneva Summit with Presidents Biden and Putin. In your book, you basically quote the press conference of President Biden, and I just would like to read it because I find it very interesting. We are 3 years after this, and it seems like we live in a completely different world. He said, the bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there is mutual interest for us to cooperate, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world. One of those areas is strategic stability. At the same time, you say, and you mentioned this before, for Russia, the Geneva Summit was likely staged, managed diplomacy, meant to distract from a war that nobody was predicting in the summer of 2021. Could you please elaborate more on these different objectives?
Sure. Well, the counter-argument to what I say is that Putin, in the first few months of the Biden administration, had a wait-and-see attitude. He was waiting and seeing what would be offered. And what the Biden administration offered was approval of the Nord Stream 2 project between Germany and Russia. And what the U.S. offered were strategic stability dialogues, or perhaps Russia offered that and the U.S. Agreed. And Biden took a tone, although he had called Putin a killer and a thug on the campaign trail, he took a tone, especially in Geneva, it seemed notable to me at the time, that was quite respectful. But it's also very possible that this on the Russian side was just not enough, that there was the expectation that there would be some real movement on Ukraine. So if the U.S. wants to deal with China and not have Russia as a problem, the concession that has to be made is a concession on Ukraine, some sort of major concession. And in the absence of that, when that didn't come to pass, either in Geneva or shortly thereafter, then Putin changed his calculus and started to think about a major war against Ukraine. So that's entirely possible. For a historian, what's devilishly challenging about this whole subject is how little information we have about Russian decision-making, period. So the one thing I'm not comfortable saying is Putin thought this and this was the Russian plan. I really don't know. So that is one possible interpretation of events, but there is the Russian military buildup in the spring. And so did Putin do that only for the sake of getting a meeting with Biden? That seems improbable to me. I think the more probable, in a way, the more literal interpretation of that is that you build up and you scale back for the sake of deception, because the second time it's done, you assume that people are going to respond as they did the first time. You'll sort of build up, it's a bluff, it's another bluff, and that gives you the advantage of surprise if you're really going to wage war. Of course, the equipment that was put around Ukraine in the spring of 2021 is the equipment that's used. It's just left there, and then the troops are kind of moved in. What occurs to me, and again, this is just pure speculation, is that the challenge that Putin had when it came to waging the war was living in an age of social media and of transparency, that he couldn't hide the military buildup. That's not an option. Maybe 50 years ago, that's what a military could do. You could sort of do that and nobody would see it, but you can't do that in 2021. So he had to confuse people about what he was doing, and that's, to me, my current interpretation of the Geneva Summit, that it was really an effort to confuse, to kind of dangle diplomacy at that point, but not for the sake of diplomacy as such, but for the sake of maximum confusion. And I feel somewhat confident in that judgment because of all of the diplomatic initiatives that Russia made in November and December of 2021, which were these ultimatums and these kind of pressure, sort of very speedy, pressure-laden diplomacy, which again was enormously confusing and put people off balance and allowed Putin to achieve, because it is a success on the Russian part, in Russia's terms, allows Russia to succeed in surprising Ukraine. You, of course, have the German intelligence director is in Kiev on the morning of the invasion, and probably the majority of European countries, I think it's fair to say, did not think that the invasion was going to occur on the 24th of February. So if it was an effort at deception, as I argue in the book, it was a successful one. But I would just say take it with a grain of salt, because we all struggle in the absence of real and good evidence.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for this. Thomas, can I ask you just quickly on this quote from President Biden, that he was ready to work with the Russian president on the areas of mutual interest, such as strategic stability. And we know that indeed this dialogue started on the official level. It was launched in 21. Then understandably, it ceased on the 24th of February. And in his book, Michael says that during the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, Khrushchev and Kennedy found their way out of the labyrinth, prompting more communication between Moscow and Washington. So my question is there any chance for dialogue between United States and Russia today on topics of common concern or common interest?
Yeah, that is the big discussion on what can still be compartmentalized today. And I think the answer right now is a very sobering one, very little. For a while after, one should also say that I wouldn't say, that these meetings, there were two meetings that in the framework of the strategic stability dialogue that took place. The third one was basically already a total crisis management meeting. It wasn't really focused on strategic stability. But these meetings were not immediately delivering, but in a way they were still seen to be relatively promising. And in parallel, there was also a meeting on cybersecurity that was relatively successful because it was clear the two sides defined red lines. We never saw anything formal, but I think we could tell that this was the case. So that was all, perhaps not super promising, but also not the contrary. And in that sense, why then these escalatory steps? What triggered them? Was it indeed, as you argue, was it a long-term plan of Putin? Which, for me, Putin has always operated in an action-reaction way. And he has never had a big strategy. And so in a way, if your hypothesis is true, he would have had a strategy that he pursued basically, somewhere from 2020 or early 2021 on. I'm not sure, but I agree with you, we don't know, because we just have not enough evidence on how Russian decision-making happened. Now, back to your question. Today, look, as some of you may know, we are conducting a strategic stability roundtable, which is a track on 5 process between Russians and Americans. That was relatively promising until last summer. That also triggered this US non-paper that was basically offering unconditionally nuclear arms control negotiations to the Russians. The Russians answered end of last year with a flat no, basically arguing that in their perception, strategic stability is now a function also of Ukraine. Meaning that we cannot compartmentalize anymore the classical strategic stability agenda with nuclear, outer space, etc. That was a broad range of things from Ukraine. And I think that's a pity. There are still some regions that seem to be compartmentalization, such a difficult term, seems to be possible. For instance, Syria, perhaps to an extent, also other parts of the Middle East, perhaps also other geographies. I think one would have to figure out, how far we can still compartmentalize. But I think the space has shrunk, is much smaller today than it was in the months after the invasion.
And compartmentalization?
I just wanted to offer two thoughts to complement yours, Thomas, on this question. I think it's very difficult to see anything good in this war because it's so overwhelmingly bad. But in terms of red lines, picking up the point about a discussion of red lines within the strategic stability groups in the fall of 2021, what you have to say empirically is that for Europe and for the US alike, red lines haven't been crossed with Russia and vice versa in a way that would provoke a larger war or what you could describe as great power conflict. Now, maybe that's dumb luck. Maybe that's accident. Maybe Russia has no capacity or intent to drive the war beyond Ukraine. But I suspect that there is a more active intelligence at work. And it makes me not entirely pessimistic about this possibility of communicating, going back and forth. This is a really dynamic, sprawling, fluid conflict, much worse than anything Europe witnessed in the Cold War. It's not equivalent to the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It's much more difficult to contain. And yet, it has, on certain levels, been contained. And so I think we do want to acknowledge that point if we're able to build on it in the future. That's something that we want to, at the very least, be aware of. Secondly, I think it's very important when we think about the diplomacy that will terminate this war to distinguish between two kinds of diplomacy. One is point-blank settlement that will end the war on terms satisfactory to Russia, to Ukraine, to Europe and the US. That's a good aspiration to have. It seems to me almost impossibly out of reach at the present moment. There is, however, a different kind of diplomacy, which you could describe as the search for rules of engagement. And I'm very glad, Sasha, that you brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis in this context, because that is what the US and the Soviet Union achieved in the midst of the Cold War. Not at the beginning. Cold War was really out of control at the beginning. But over time, and of course prompted by the fear that the Cuban Missile Crisis unleashed, there was an ability to discuss rules of engagement. And it is remarkable when you think chronologically from 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis in 1975, the signing of the Helsinki Final Act is 13 years, and that's sort of a masterpiece of finding rules of engagement. I don't think that's impossible under current circumstances. More difficult now than it will be when the war goes on, but to me, that's where I think we should be focusing our efforts. And frankly, I'm just not pessimistic about that. I think it has been done in the past and could be done in the future because this is, I think, the core element of why it could be successful. It's in the interests of all the parties. It's in nobody's interest to have a massive world war among nuclear powers. And so if it's an interest, then we can build on that and perhaps achieve something in the future.
I think what basically results out of the 2 points you said is first, that Article 5 of NATO really works. And maybe the second one, that some observers find that right now we are at the stage of the final stages of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Ukraine. So basically, we are moving towards this major escalation, and there might be very soon this push for establishing to search for this rules of engagement. But I would like to discuss maybe this topic of the future steps just after a short session of Q&A, if we can take those now. I will just remind and government, I know that to our audience online also to start preparing the questions and send them to us. We will read them in the second Q&A session discussion. Gazman, please.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Professor. So you mentioned the word collisions, and that's a very interesting term in a way. You mentioned that there are 3 of those in your book. Now, looking ahead, based on your thesis and the discussions until now, looking ahead, we're seeing how climate change, for example, is impacting the Arctic. We're seeing now that a lot of focus, Europe had an hour of the Hour of Europe in 2012, 2013, but now we're also seeing a shift more to the east. So based on your knowledge and expertise until now, how would you extrapolate that knowledge into a future potential shift in geopolitical tensions? And Ambassador Greminger, you mentioned the contact group and you mentioned a lack of frameworks. So based on my question to the professor here, what kind of frameworks and what kind of new opportunities do you think we could find in a potential future of more looking at a way to Asia? Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll take one more question and then back to you.
I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Leonardo Bencini. I'm the Italy's disarmament ambassador in Geneva, and I spent 8 years in Russia. I was the economic counselor in February 2014 when we worked together with our EU colleagues on the first sanctions and also after MH17. I have a question for Professor Kimmage. You said that this war was not inevitable. As a diplomat, that's what I like to I have to think. And we have to believe that diplomacy can avoid and should avoid wars. But don't you think that, and you mentioned a number of specific episodes, but don't you think there is something perhaps fundamental here? I see two aspects of fundamental issues. One is that when you look at the end of the Soviet Union, that was not just the end of the Soviet Union, that was the end of the Russian Empire that was created, whose beginning was 3 centuries earlier, and that was a huge trauma to the Russian psyche, and you have to consider that aspect, and certainly that's one thing. And you said maybe we could have done more, the West could have done more. You mentioned the possible Marshall Plan. Well, when I look at what we did, we welcomed Russia in the G8 in 1997. We had a summit in Pratica di Mare chaired by the then Italian Prime Minister in 2002. Putin came to meet all the other heads of states and governments of NATO countries. 2002, and then we had 2003, the Iraq War, and that's when things began to go in a array. But it took a long time because I still remember in 2010 with Medvedev as president, we were even talking about Euro-Asian community from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And when I remember those days, I think it's very hard for me to believe that we were actually discussing those issues and believing in them. And you have to think of all the huge investments that we put into Russia. We helped them modernize their economy from 2000 onwards. And all the major investments that modernized the oil, gas and oil industry in Russia were made by major international corporations. So we put a lot of money into Russia and a lot of trust and a lot of hope. And then Bolotnaya happened, and then that's the other aspect. So one is the end of the Russian Empire, the other one is civil society. What do you do with that? And then we saw a change in end of 2011 and 2012. A change which was clearly incompatible with the idea of power and society that leadership had in mind. And clearly, as Michael McFaul sometimes said, Putin is not afraid of the expansion of NATO, he's afraid of the expansion of democracy. This is what Michael McFaul said. So now on one hand, you have a Russia that believes that they cannot exist without Ukraine, because this is what they believe, that a Russia without Ukraine doesn't make sense. On the other hand, you have a Russia that has a different idea of how a society should be structured. So these are two fundamental things. So do you think that diplomacy could have done anything to prevent those things to come to to what they came eventually?
Sure. But these are wonderful questions. To start with the question about geopolitics and collisions and what this may portend for the future, two thoughts. One is the unbelievable complexity of the war. Maybe all wars are complicated, I'm sure that they are, but this one to me seems acutely complicated. And let me just mention a few things that haven't come up so far that I think matter in this regard. I would not have predicted before the 2022 war that food security would be connected to the war in the way that it is, because Russia and Ukraine, of course, are both major grain suppliers. If we think back to the Syrian civil war, that's of course caused in part by global warming, which you mentioned, but it's also caused by a drought and higher food prices, hunger, and that created unrest and instability in Syria, which then generated a massive civil war, 11 million refugees, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm afraid that this war has already had something of that effect in ways that will be disentangling for a long time to come. Another effect of the war is the recalibrated relationship between Russia and Iran, which is to a degree accidental because Iran has chosen to supply Russia with drones and drone technology. But I do think that that has created a more emboldened Iran. It would be simplistic and silly to say that October 7th goes back directly to Ukraine, but it is my supposition that you probably don't have an October 7th in Israel without the war in Ukraine. So there too, you see this sort of very complicated new kaleidoscopic geometry of global collision, which is going far afield from the territory of both Russia and Ukraine, and then issues of inflation connected to the war. There's a great article in the New York Times recently about European farmers and how fertilizer and energy is higher because of costs for them are higher, and they're getting drawn more toward right-wing movements. And again, that's not absolutely directly related to the war, but you can kind of see that these effects are taking place. So the complexity of that just demands analysis, consideration, and our attention, and that I think will yield new understandings of the global environment. A second point, which I'll make just very briefly, I finished reading recently David Sanger's book called New Cold Wars, and he has to me a baffling sentence in the conclusion of that book. He said, this shows this period of geopolitical tension that globalization is over. I don't think that that's true at all. I think what the war in Ukraine shows is that there are now, as perhaps there have always been, multiple globalizations. Russia's a global power. It uses its global networks to fuel its economy, to build its war machine, to shape public opinion, which Russia does with a fair degree of talent, I would say, especially since October 7th. And there's one globalization, and Russia-China is another avenue of globalization. And of course, Ukraine is supported not just by a transatlantic coalition, but by a global coalition. Singapore, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, probably the most important non-European partner that Ukraine has. So new patterns and forms of globalization are also coming into effect, and in a way, the war is a kind of lens or a window into that. So that's the best I can do in terms of looking to the future and using the war to try to help us to understand the future. To go over to your two very probing questions, let me answer your extremely cogent questions with a somewhat obfuscating paradox. Although I can't stand the Winston Churchill quote about Russia, the enigma wrapped in mystery, shrouded in fog, and covered in confusion, or whatever it was that Churchill said about it's a country that one can, with some effort, I think, arrive at basic understandings of. It's not all mystery, but I'm going to mystify just a little bit because I think it's, for me, the most adequate way of answering your question about the inevitability of this conflict on the Russian side and sort of what generated it. I think if you could have polled Russians on the 23rd of February 2022 as to whether they wish to invade Ukraine, I think that 90 or 95% of Russians would have said no. Makes no sense. These are our neighbors. These are our friends, family members in many cases. For what? What's the point of it? World War II is over. What's Russia going to gain from this, and who's going to pay the price? I think all of those questions would have been answered with a negative judgment about whether Russia should invade. If that's the case, if that's true, there was a kind of westernization that occurred within Russia between 1991 and 2022. It wasn't all just window dressing. It wasn't all fake. It was sort of real, and that speaks to some of the things that you were mentioning, that a lot of doors were open for Russia, which is certainly true. For students, for academics, for scientists, for people in the business world, politics, et cetera. In a way, Russia was kind of ushered into a new world. And what's even more complicated under the current circumstances is Russia entered that world. If you would go to Moscow in those years, you would see a city that was fairly rapidly Europeanizing in many ways. And that, again, was not an illusion. It was something of effect. So that's sort of point number one, which I think speaks to the Russia beyond Putin. But then Putin plunges his country into this war, which is a war of aggression, a war of conquest. I don't think provoked, certainly nothing that I said before about the Marshall Plan or the failures of diplomatic engagement in 2013. For me, none of that indicates that the West is responsible for the 2022 invasion. So an unprovoked war, and you do have, maybe 1 million Russians who leave, some for practical reasons, some for political or ideological reasons. You have almost no anti-war movement to speak of. You have lots, 30,000 a month, of Russians who are volunteering for money usually to fight in the war. And you have a country that seems, at least from the outside, to be sort of in lockstep with the war effort. So that has to be explained by history and political culture, and of course by the kind of dictatorship that Putin has constructed in Russia, where it's a criminal offense to speak against the war, and there are lots of instruments of repression that make all of this easier for the Kremlin. But you put those 2 points together, the lack of desire for a war, but then the lack of opposition to the war once it starts, and you get something of a paradox. But that's what I would offer you in return to your question, is that paradox. I can't come up with a, to me, more direct or more simple answer, I'm afraid.
Well, just very briefly, this is of course a very complicated question that you raised. Building on, the new patterns of globalization, the different globalizations that we are witnessing today, I think, we have entered this world order of, multipolarity, and there is a lot of questioning of this rule-based international order that has, created for stability, predictability for a few decades. And so this new multipolar reality has not created any stable order yet. We have all kinds of new institutions popping up, new alliances popping up. You have these an inflation of minilateral structures that bring together like-minded countries. But at the same time, these comprehensive and inclusive multilateral institutions, they're struggling. And I think we need to somehow come up with a new order, with a new understanding of how, inclusive multilateral institutions operate, what they're based on. Fact is, that these different poles that make up this multipolar world haven't been really order shaping, So BRICS has mainly been, well, let me be very blunt, destructive, has been, been an anti-US, anti-Western platform. Has it produced any constructive order yet? No. Same with many other, institutions that have been created. Also, if you look at the track record of institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think beyond being a political platform that is regularly extremely well attended, the outcome is very, very thin, right? And so basically, I think the challenge is to construct an order where, again, we can all buy into. And that's a tall order. Thank you.
And talking about multipolarity and new global order, maybe let's move further and look into the future. Michael, you write Russia's relations with the West will be conflictual for a long time to come. So what are the consequences of this major conflict for the future of European but also global security?
Well, just to spell out why I think they'll be conflictual for a long time to come is sort of a thought experiment. What would Russia have to do to normalize relations with the West, unless there would be big political changes here, would have to remove all of its soldiers from the territory of Ukraine and would have to agree to war crimes tribunals for much of the Russian political and military elite. Now, there may be Russian politicians willing to entertain those kinds of ideas. I'm not aware of too many. But even if they would, and even if they would gain power, I think it would be very difficult to keep power in Russia with those ideas. One of the things that Putin has done very consciously is not just to make the governing elite complicit in the war, but to make the society complicit in the war. And that's just a very difficult thing to unwind, given that no country is going to march into Russia and sort of instigate a sort of World War II type defeat of the kind that was put together for Nazi Germany, but then followed by occupation and a kind of re-education of the country. So it's sort of hard for me to imagine Russia getting away from that complicity. Maybe that's too bleak. I hope it is. But that to me seems something of a given in the current situation. I think from that followed two sobering conclusions. One is that just wrapping things up in Ukraine is going to be really, really hard. And that's why I focus on rules of engagement, that we can minimize conflict, we can maximize normalcy for Ukraine, we can expedite Ukraine's westward path. I think all of that is achievable. But to have a real termination, a kind of real end of the conflict, if Russia remains invested in it, is just going to be difficult. So that's one conclusion to draw. The other conclusion to draw is equally sobering, and it's the utter lack of cooperation between the West and Russia. And Russia is now unwilling to compartmentalize in many countries, including my own. There's usually no appetite for doing any kind of business with Russia, diplomatic or otherwise, whether related to Ukraine or related to other issues. And so arms control has vanished. At least West Russia arms control has vanished, which is terrifying, of course. Cooperation on pandemics, cooperation on climate change, cooperation on the Arctic, all of which might be in our kind of collective mutual interest, is not going to happen because of this rift between Russia and the West. And the current metastasizing crisis in the Middle East is not only reflecting a lack of cooperation, but you have Russia and the West really on opposite sides. And it's really striking compared to where Russia was 10 years ago. Russia was the country that would talk to Hamas and talk to the Palestinian Authority and talk to Israel and sort of be omnipresent. And now it's really chosen a side. And that's, of course, not the side on which, I won't speak for Switzerland, but it's not the side on which the U.S. stands. And if you project that into the Asian theater and think of mounting tensions there, you can just see how Russia is also going to be, from a U.S. point of view, part of the problem. So that's very, very sobering in terms of what this rift means. But it's just an indication of the size, scope, and scale of the rift itself.
No, it is indeed, and I think that's what we hear today a lot, that the future, at least European security order, will be based on deterrence. But I would like to ask Thomas, do you think there any chance to add elements of cooperative security to this future deterrence-based European security order? And if that could be possible, what would be the building blocks for this new European security order?
It all depends on how this war continues or ends. I mean, the most likely scenario is unfortunately for me still the continuation of high intensity warfare. But I would argue even there we would need some sort of cooperative security component in the sense of more robust crisis communication. Right now, Michael, you alluded to there is some escalation control, but it's probably largely unilateral. I don't think that there is, to our knowledge, there is no mechanism, a bilateral mechanism, that would manage escalation. So I think that's something that one could think about, introducing a robust crisis communication mechanism that then eventually perhaps also, could move from an escalatory trend that we are currently seeing to a de-escalatory trend of conducting the war. Another scenario, if there is at some point a freezing of the situation by some sort of a negotiated a ceasefire, we are, probably gonna end up with a situation that we could probably call a new Cold War, with a very clear separation line through Europe, and a more complicated setup than during the First Cold War, but still, I think with a lot of phenomenon that are similar. Which again, I think if you recall the history of the Cold War, there were serious attempts. There was also political leadership that tried to manage the Cold War to prevent it from turning hot, to also try to go for processes that would gradually allow to overcome the rift. And we all, of course, would dream of Minsk 2.0 at some point in time. Obviously, we are light years away from that, but that would be a scenario or a vision. If at some point we manage, to venture into more comprehensive settlement negotiations and are capable of settling the conflict, this would then obviously offer much wider opportunities to kind of reconstruct a European security order that would again, contain significant elements of cooperative security and would not rely exclusively on deterrence. But again, I think this is such an optimistic scenario that we hardly dare to think of.
Thank you very much. I think on this slightly optimistic note, we can move back to our Q&A session. I invite my colleagues to send me if there is something, and I will start with you.
Thank you very much for very interesting discussion, Professor and Your Excellency Ambassador. Myself, I am from the Russian mission, from Minsk, from this place where dragons are. My question is about the last point about development of the situation. And I would like to bring to the discussion the situation of Caribbean crisis. There was a very interesting moment. By the way, Kennedy was Democrat as well. The campus where you worked, like Obama, Joe Biden. Kennedy was in Berlin when he was invited by Willy Brandt in the time of better relations with Soviet Union. But after Caribbean crisis, Khrushchev brought flowers personally to Embassy of America in Moscow. What I mean that Caribbean crisis was a very swift, very painful escalation of the situation, which ended mutual recognition and compassion. Unfortunately, John Kennedy was shot. Khrushchev was removed from his reign. But it is an example how the really situation when everybody was not sure about the morning whether he will be alive or not, ended by recognition by two adversaries, harsh adversaries who were ready or not ready to really end this world. Could it be the development in this situation? My feeling is that Russia is rebelling, trying to regain its recognition as a power. It's not a question about Donbass, Crimea, or territory. It's a question about recognition as it is in United Nations Charter 1945. Not about some other rules. So it was very interesting moment that you mentioned that Joe Biden, I remember this picture when he presented sunglasses to Mr. Putin, he extended his hand to work together. but he suggested to follow, as I understood now, some rules, because now it's also a question in political discourse, whether rules or United Nations Charter. And there are different understandings on what these rules are. What you proposed is quite a different perspective as for me. It's just a general proposal to work together. Why it didn't happen? And don't you expect that Mr. Putin wants United States to recognize his country, and not him, but Russia as a superpower?
Question? I will take.
If there's no one, if I may.
There's no-
Yeah, please go. Yeah, of course.
Yes, I find this distinction into three levels of conflicts or three different separate coalitions very convincing. And I'm trying to think of how they interact and influence each other. And I'm wondering right now, so where could a positive momentum for dialogue come from? If you could give any advice or decision makers, where to start? Yes.
Who would like to go first?
Yeah, Michael
Question?
goes first. Then I have more time to think about it.
Well, the term superpower is not, as far as I know, a technical term. It's sort of a term that's ascribed to different kinds of powers in the world, and I'm trying to come to grips with your question about the recognition of Russia as a superpower. And I don't know for American foreign policy if that means all that much. Which countries are superpowers, which countries are not. What I can say, sort of speaking a little bit on behalf of the U.S., although I certainly don't work in the government and I'm not here in that capacity at all, but just trying to imagine what the response not of an individual would be to your question, but a government's response to your question would be, is that the recognition of Russia as such is something that the United States has done since 1991. It goes back to some of the comments that were made earlier, often with a fair amount of generosity, not to mention the mistakes that are made. But that recognition from a U.S. perspective can't entail recognition of illegal annexations. It can't entail the violation of countries' territorial integrity and sovereignty, and it certainly can't entail the kind of war crimes and abuses of which Russia is conspicuously guilty in its war in Ukraine. And one could go down the long list of those abuses, but I think that they're so well known that it doesn't need reiteration. So there's a lot about Russia that can be recognized, can, should, and is recognized. But if superpower status entails a certain set of rules that are particular and unique to Russia, I don't think that that's going to work for the U.S. Of course, you could switch the debate and accuse the U.S. of hypocrisy of writing its own rules, and that's another debate that we could have. But I think from the U.S. perspective, there's no special status to being a superpower. In a way, the rights that Russia has as a superpower in the international system are the rights that Latvia has, and the rights that Moldova has, and the rights that Ukraine has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that, in a sense, is the core of the problem that Joe Biden's White House or that the U.S. government has with Russia at the present moment. So I don't mean to be polemical in response to your question, but that's what I would offer you. I think in terms of momentum for dialogue, I feel like we've covered that ground to some extent already. And your question was about positive momentum. Let me say something cautionary and then try to say something more on the positive side. What makes me feel cautionary about this description of the war as a three-part collision is, again, the challenge of unwinding all of those different tension points. It would be hard enough if it were only Russia-Ukraine. But because it is Russia-Europe, Russia-US, and you can come up with other axes of conflict and tension at the current moment, it's like the geometry is not that binary geometry of previous wars, but this other geometry I struggle to come to grips with that, and it makes me a bit worried about finding positive momentum or finding solutions. But maybe you could put it in these terms, in terms of positive momentum, is that the sheer interest that we all have in ending this conflict. I'll put the interest maybe not on the side of the Kremlin, which seems eager to perpetuate it, but on the Russian people, I think there's an interest, for the Russian people, there's an interest in ending the conflict. Certainly Ukraine is most invested in an end to the conflict. For Europe, if the war is causing instability, inflation, polarization, all of the bad things that the war is causing, there's an incentive to come to an end. And for the US, the war is certainly a negative factor as well. And we could go back to other points about food insecurity and global debits that are occurring because of the war. So there's lots of incentive. Maybe we need to be aware of that vast architecture of incentive and use it to positive effect, which might not be the case if it were a very regional or local conflict where it would only be a few groups that would benefit from termination. In a sense, putting it very grandly, going back to the language of Biden's quote from the summit with Putin and Biden, the world would benefit from this war being over. So let's not forget that in terms of our conceptualization of it.
On your question, acknowledging Russia as I would, use the term great power. I just read Tom Graham's book, Getting Russia Right, and summarizing a brilliant book. He said basically over the last 30 years we should have simply tried to accept Russia as a great power instead of trying to transform it into a Western democracy, and instead of trying to come up with all these hedges against Russia turning again an imperial power. I mean, that's in a nutshell what he argues, and I think he argues it quite plausibly. This said, if you want to be respected as a great power, this also comes along, I think, with acceptable behavior. And here, you also need to reflect a bit politically. I mean, when there was this troop build up, the first one of Russia around Ukraine, but also the second, it was this message, take us seriously. But, any Western politician, if he had offered any concession, this would have be perceived as a major sign of weakness. Basically, you just need to come up with the troop build up, and then, concessions will follow suit. I mean, politics just don't work like that. And I think the same, when this. I think also, when we look far ahead, I think many Europeans would love to have Russia at some point again be as a part of European security, and not a European security order that is constructed against Russia, which is currently, what is happening. But again, this would imply that you have a counterpart in Moscow that is ready to respect the international law, does not aggress its neighbors, does not try to change borders by military force. I think once we, come again to an understanding that this is, of acceptable behavior, I think, we can start reconstructing European security. To Linda's question, where would one see openings? The thing is, the complication is that these three levels of coalitions, they're all interlinked. And you cannot simply address one level. For instance, of course, Russians would love to talk to Americans and, go for a Yalta 2 and sort out But perhaps that is, what the next administration will try to do. I doubt it, by the way. But, that's what some people think would happen, some sort of a Yalta 2. I think this is not going to happen. It's just not possible because it cannot deal with the complexities that these three coalitions have created. But let me still end with something more positive. I think if there were political will, what could be a way forward? Well, start de-escalating. The way you conduct the war, you have different options. You can further escalate by targeting even more objects, or you can refrain from targeting, for instance, certain objects. I mean, there are ways, how you can slowly de-escalate. And that is a strong way of signaling that you're ready, to slowly but surely start targeting. And then also when it comes to settlement-related issues, signaling, could be important. You could signal, for instance, some ideas how you would consider offering security guarantees to your opponent, and not just call for Ukrainian neutrality. I mean, this is easy from a Russian point of view. But what is more complicated is to come up with ideas on how to, give security guarantees to Ukraine that are better than the violated Budapest Memorandum. Or, again, when it comes to territories, right now, the Russian government says, oh, of course, we are ready to negotiate any time. Of course, you have to consider the new territorial realities on the ground. That's not a very encouraging signal. Again, think politically, how could Zelensky sell, such a situation to his own constituency? So I think signaling could be a way of opening up and showing to the other side, look, if you send back an equally constructive signal, we might then embark on a more constructive trajectory and eventually decide, to go back to the negotiation table.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm looking at my watch. We have 3 minutes left, so I think I'll take last question from here, and then let you also, if you would like, in answering, provide any closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Sasha, and thank you to both of you for this really stimulating and articulate set of reflections. I wanted to just come back to the allusion that was made to the period from 1962 to 1975, and that we're maybe somewhere close to 1962 now, but we can envisage something similar going forward. And that period, including, by the way, the early 1970s, demonstrates that it's possible to reach certain agreements even as we compete vigorously and navigate diplomatic crises. But nonetheless, there are some important distinctions, I would guess, between that initial period and what we're living through now, in part because, Brezhnev at the time in the 70s very much wanted a deal to assert Soviet status in Europe and to cement the post-war status quo, territorial status quo. Whereas whether or the extent to which Vladimir Putin wants a deal, or is rather someone who prepares, is more prepared to thrive on the uncertainty that not having deals necessarily brings about, is an open question. But beyond that, there was also a balance of power in Europe in the 1970s, whereas now the European security, economic, and political order are based on two institutions that are completely closed to Russian membership. So keeping all of that in mind, it seems to me, and Michael, you made this clear as well, that there isn't necessarily a day after when it comes to these crises. So we're in a situation now that's even hotter than at any point during the Cold War. These powers are not just competing, they're very much in open conflict. I assume we'll have to settle ceteris paribus for something that's far less than the Helsinki Final Act when the time finally comes in 10 to 15 years. My question to you is a very difficult one, which is, what does that look like in terms of Russia's place in Europe, especially as we enter a period of global history where the international order is much less Eurocentric than it was before?
Sure. It's a great question, Zach, and of course a really tough one. Conclude with 2 points. On the second point, we'll just sort of wrap up my comments today with gratitude for all of these really stimulating and incisive questions. I think that it's not quite what you're asking about, but I'm just thinking about that period, sort of 62 to 75, or maybe thinking about the Cold War more broadly. In one way, the situation that we're in now is better than it was during the Cold War. Probably not for Europe, but thinking a bit beyond Europe, I think it's good that neither the United States nor Russia or Russia/China is engaged in some massive missionary zero-sum global great game. And so if a country in the Sahel switches from sort of affinity for US military presence to a Russian military presence, that doesn't engender a massive effort in Washington to send 10,000 American troops to the Sahel simply for the sake of preventing Russia from achieving a win there. But that really was the kind of awful, terrible, horrific logic of the Cold War. And the great atrocities of the Cold War, the great bloodshed of the Cold War was outside of Europe. And I think a lot of it in retrospect, easy to say in retrospect perhaps, but a lot of it was really senseless. Certainly for the United States, the Vietnam War, which is happening smack in the middle of those years, 62 to 75, is a truly senseless event, a very costly and senseless event. And it was driven by this rigid global view of what the Cold War was. I think in some ways we're now more flexible in that regard, and that's really to the good. And we should preserve that flexibility and perhaps even build on it, going back to what Thomas was saying earlier about certain, sort of an international order that allows for degrees of cooperation versus an international order that's premised only on conflict, coercion, and things like deterrence. So maybe when we look back to that period, we can actually derive a certain kind of optimism from it and instill that in our present day selves. But here's the second point, which is just a bit more ambiguous. One of the things I don't understand about the present moment, because I'm a historian of the Cold War, is precisely what you were alluding to, Zach, which is that during the Cold War, you have all of these proxy wars. It wasn't just Vietnam, right? It's proxy wars basically everywhere. And you have a lot of real diplomacy. I mean, not, marginal this and that diplomacy that's, forgotten about 6 months after it's conducted, or sort of ceremonial diplomacy. I mean, the kind of real diplomacy that was the backbone in some ways of the Cold War, as much as the proxy wars, the violence, the espionage, the ideological competition was. Why was it that was possible then? And seems, if not impossible now, much more difficult at the present moment. So I don't have a solution to the present moment, but being a historian, I would urge all of us, sort of end on an evangelical note, to study the history of the Cold War with this question in mind. What perhaps can we learn from it? Perhaps it goes back, sir, to your question about the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of its after effects. And there are other ways that we can learn from the Cold War story and the record about how, as you put it, vigorous competition, but at the same time, pragmatic and in some respects really visionary diplomacy could coexist. So if it could coexist then, surely it could coexist in the future, and that leaves me all the more perplexed about why it's not coexisting in the present.
Thank you, Michael. Thomas.
I think, Michael, one reason why we have less or practically no formal diplomacy today we could now have a long discussion on how diplomacy evolved over the last years, and I have another very positive assessment of that. But I think one of the reasons is because we have a hot war in midst of Europe, and that's just different than a war in Vietnam or somewhere, far away. Now it's in midst of us. And I think that makes it extremely difficult for any, Western politician to be seen, talking to a Russian. And by the way, now we have, a similar, different but similar, reflexes on the Russian side that, it is less and less popular to be seen talking to any Westerners. I mean, we see that in our dialogue business. You know, it has. I mean, you know that, Zach. So that may be a reason why we see hardly any track one diplomacy, and so why some of us here in Geneva try to kind of partly compensate by establishing back channels, communication, etc. Also with quite some pushback. But learning, and let me conclude on a positive note, learning from the Cold War. I think that even though it's more complicated today, but still, I think there was, for instance, in 1967, and sorry for those that hear me say this regularly, there was the wisdom in NATO to come up with a NATO doctrine that was coined by Harmel, that argued we need, of course, this deterrence pillar that is central, but we always need a second pillar, and that is state-owned and dialogue. Keep a door open for dialogue. If the other side is willing to cooperate, let there be an open door. And I think that is something that I would advocate. We should do today. And then, it took 5 years until what then led to the Minsk Final Accord, the Minsk process could be started. And it takes also then political leadership, leaders, that are ready to invest political capital in these processes. And I hope we may see some of these people around.
You meant Helsinki.
What did I say?
Minsk.
Yeah, that's it. Because we've been talking with this. Yeah, of course. I meant, yeah, absolutely. I meant the Helsinki process that led to the Helsinki.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our speakers for their very important reflections and insights, and also trying to be positive in this very difficult situation with a round of applause. My colleagues here at the GCSP who made it happen, Zachary, Christina, Liang, who is not with us now, Florian, Alice, Catalina, Alexandra, thank you all for the preparations of this event. We look forward to welcoming you back very soon for our next event in the Geneva Security Debate series. Our next event will feature former NATO Deputy Secretary General, and she was also, for instance, chief U.S. negotiator of the New START treaty with the Russian Federation, Rose Goettemüller, who will be here on the 3rd of June at the same time from 12 to 2, and she will discuss with us nuclear arms control, reflecting on the past and looking into the future. So I invite you to come back here and to continue these very interesting exchanges. Thank you very much. I wish you a very nice day.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for your question.